Check, 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 check.
We're going to go in a minute. Welcome to the show, the live broadcast, the live podcast of Indestructible Souls. Here with psychotherapist Jonathan Beauregard. We're just kind of wait till 5 o'clock gets started with my special guest. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. I know I'm old because I can't see the camera, so I need my phone. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce the platform of the podcast. Let me hear your levels.
Check, check.
All right, sounds good. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the podcast Indestructible Souls. Let me give you a little bit of background, where that name came from and what's the platform for the podcast moving forward. The name Indestructible Souls comes from the Public Enemy song, Brother's Gonna Work It Out. We need a piece of this rock or gold of indestructible soul. And for years, that term has always resonated with me. For one, being an African-American black man in America, growing up in a city and growing up in a time where, well, it's funny because here we are at 2020 and we still feel like it's the same time. So not much has changed. So Indestructible Soul, to me, and the reason why the platform is so important is that this society, they take so much away from us and they do so many different things. However, they cannot have our soul. They want our soul, but they can't have it. And so there's so many things about us. They can lock us up. Obviously, we can see that they kill us, but at the same time, they cannot have what's inside of us. They can't have our spirit. They can't have our mind. They can't have our creativity, even though they try to steal it. But we'll get there. So today's topic in the platform, the ultimate platform for this podcast, is to really give black men and black boys who really kind of have a taboo belief about mental health to talk about mental wellness in different aspects and give us a place to really learn some things. So anybody, it's not just for black men and black boys, but anybody who have relationships with African-American men and boys, teachers, parents, social workers, whoever comes in constant contact, this platform is for you. You're going to learn some things. And we're going to come to a place and come to a point where you can understand us better. We can understand ourselves better, as well as rewriting the narrative. Because right now, in my opinion, the biggest threat to American society is the African-American men and boys. There's nothing more feared, nothing more scary than being or someone seeing a black person, particularly black men. We're the biggest threat. And so this podcast is going to help change that narrative. And so we're going to get right into it for today's topic. As you know, there's a lot going on. And in the wake of the George Floyd lynching and murder, you know, I'm sitting here with my nephew, and he's a police officer. I'm going to let him introduce himself. But me and him have had several conversations over the past few months about him being a police officer, how I view it, and the Ahmaud Arbery incident, and so we often have these candid conversations, and so we thought it'd be a good idea if we had one of these live on the podcast, so we can hear each other out. He's not going to change my mind, by the way. I believe what I believe, but I think raw, authentic conversation, especially with those who we view as the enemy, is beneficial to us. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jr. real quick. Let him introduce himself. And just let me say this: by no way his views or my views direct, or however you say that, on the department that he works for. This is his personal views as a young man, and so go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, yeah, like I was introduced. Some people know me as Jr. Hector, Officer Cuevas. I've been a police officer for 2.5 years now. Worked for 2 different departments, both on the custody and street level. Basically got into been a police officer for, like I said, a little bit around 2.5 years. Got into the game of law enforcement a little bit late. I was probably about 27 when I entered the academy. Prior to that, I worked corporate America as an accountant, and also worked some warehouse jobs and different odd jobs post graduating from college. Basically, what got me into law enforcement is basically just I grew up in the inner city of Rialto, San Bernardino, Los Angeles. Have had people in my family who have served in the military. Always liked the idea of getting into law enforcement, but it was not something that was, to be truthful, very obtainable. It wasn't possible. Somebody like me growing up in the hood, saying that I wanted to become a cop was not a popular topic. And it wasn't something that seemed like it was something that I can capture, because I didn't see anybody that looked like me patrolling the streets that I grew up in. So even if I had those questions as a little boy, there was nobody to really answer those questions. I didn't have a blueprint, didn't know about an Explorer program, didn't know about any of those things. It was just basically just a thought, a little kid wanting to obtain a goal and didn't really know how.
So let's just cut right into it. So being African American, biracial, and wanting to be a cop, and when you decided to make that decision, did you get any backlash from your family or friends?
Oh yeah, I definitely got,
including me.
Definitely got a lot of backlash. So for me, the type of person I am, I definitely like to hear the thoughts and just the questions and concerns of the people that I care about most. One of the biggest people who didn't want to accept the fact that I wanted to get in law enforcement was my wife.
Okay.
She was not for it, didn't want to hear it.
So your wife being my niece, do you know her heritage and her family history when it comes to the police?
Most definitely.
So kind of getting right into it, and it's not to cut you off, but I think it's a good segue, is that for the family that you married into and being active in the city of San Bernardino, we've often had run-ins with the police. And my grandmother, who was a former city councilwoman, had one of her agendas was to fight police brutality. And anybody who knows the history of San Bernardino knows that on the west side of San Bernardino, often white cops from the other side of town come to the west side, and there was always constant police brutality and things like that. So Mia, in the sense of coming from that heritage where we've always had this adverse relationship with law enforcement. For us, they're a necessary evil. And so what do you think about that?
I think that there's some validity to that. For someone to have events that occurred in their life that's created that reality for them to feel that way, I think they have every way to feel that way.
So what did you say to change her mind?
I didn't change her mind.
Okay, so she's not okay with you being an officer.
Now she is, 3 years later.
Okay, and how did you get to that point?
Basically, we had to have a conversation with her to basically remember who her husband is, remember who she married, and ultimately know that this was the calling on my life that I needed to follow.
Okay.
And just with fasting, prayer, continuous conversation with other people around us to look at things from different perspectives, and her just being okay with the idea that she trusted me. that I was getting into a realm, right, that wasn't popular, that I was going to lose some friendships, that I was going to get some backlash from it. She was okay with allowing me to go into what the calling was for my was what the calling was for in my life. So ultimately, she wasn't okay with the idea, but she was okay with the fact that she knew who I was, and she knew what character I had inside.
Okay, so here's my fear, and I get that character. So you're 2 years plus into being an officer,
Mm-hmm.
and what happens 10 years from now? And here's what I mean. Here's what I mean by that. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned officers, white or black,
Mm-hmm.
that go into law enforcement with good intentions. Here's my problem, and we can connect this to today. Is that, in my opinion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the demonization of black people
Mm-hmm.
and demonization of poor people and people of color is entrenched in law enforcement. So how over time don't you fall trap to that? And so 20 years from now, 10 years from now, that you're still the same person?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you become some other cynical person from law enforcement that sees good versus bad, us versus them, and so forth?
And I think you hit it. I think you hit the nail on the head. That I think when you fall into that mentality of us versus them, that you've already fell into that trap. Um, we have something that we call community policing within law enforcement, which basically is to bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement, right? So to be able to, show face, pretty much get people to see you outside of the uniform. Law enforcement at one point in time, the officers who patrolled the community used to drive the patrol cars to their house.
Right, but
Used to
not.
be
But
able to park your vehicle. You know, what I mean, you get dressed in your house, leave in uniform, and go to work.
right, I remember in the '80s they created substations on the west side of San Bernardino. Don't know if they did any good, but now you have guys who don't know the community,
Mm-hmm.
don't know the neighborhoods, and then they act like they're doing us a favor by coming to our neighborhoods and policing us.
Most definitely.
Oftentimes they don't understand the people.
Most definitely, and I think that's what's important is there's a different dynamic when someone who patrols a neighborhood or community that they're familiar with, that they have family that live in that community, they either went to high school or went to school in that community or have some type of memories from their childhood or in their life within that community. You have a different sense of pride. When you're pulling over or when you're contacting a certain type of person that you are familiar with, there's not going to be fear. There's not going to be questions. There's not going to be anything. Now, we still are professionals within our job, right? So we lean on our expertise with different types of events that we've become familiar with.
Okay, but what if your upbringing as an officer is not common with mine? Now here's one of the things.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen all of these videos that's popping up of these officers overstepping their bounds. Part of the problem that I see is that when I see that person getting upset and trying to stand up for their rights, I see a person who's wanting to be heard, who's passionate, and who's trying to stand on the side of right.
Right.
Officers oftentimes see that as a threat. They see that as being disrespectful to authority. And not only that, they use that same passion as a reason to put you in handcuffs and to detain you because they don't understand us.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this goes a lot further in that how they see us.
Right.
And what I mean by that is it's one thing to walk up on a situation and everything's equal.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happens. As being an African American male, they see us differently.
Mm.
So they walk on the scene and see us as a threat. So for you, my question is, how do you handle that? And what do you do in terms of when you're approaching a situation when it's people of color,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't allow your training, or that's what you want to call it, or your biases get in the way of what the situation at hand?
To be honest, like I said, I've never even really thought about it that way because I'm so comfortable in those situations with dealing with people of color who speak passionately. They may speak loud, they may speak with their hands, right? Because that's what I'm used to. playing on the court, in the parks as a kid, being able to just kind of just, be wild or be passionate, you know what I mean? But exchange words with friends, but in the heat of a game or in the heat of just a conversation. There's been plenty of times, again, like I said, I've worked in corrections and I've also had some patrol time as well, where, like I said, if I pull over a car with 4 minorities in the car, 4 black young men or 4 peoples of color in the car, I don't necessarily may feel threatened when dealing with those people because, again, I revert back to what my childhood was. Prior to being a police officer, I was racially profiled. I was had a gun pulled out of me with a police officer. I've had instances where my family has been at a family friend's house and chaos broke out. The police were called, and my little brother was slammed on the hood of a police car and placed in handcuffs and took into arrest for resisting and delaying arrest.
So
We're
not going to talk about the times.
I've had situations like that personally, right? That I felt that I know what those feelings and emotions are. So I know when I show up on scene, just the fact that I'm in uniform, that may make somebody feel some type of way. That may, be based off of whatever their prior contacts may be with law enforcement, whatever view they may have. I remember an instance that I hold dear to my heart to this day. That prior to even me being a cop, I used to work in property management, and I remember showing this apartment to this black family, and this 3-year-old walks up to me, and she says, "Are you the police?" I had a shirt and a tie on.
Okay.
And that was it. And it mind boggled me that a 3-year-old already associate shirt, tie, police.
Absolutely.
So based off of just her, maybe just in her lifetime, she's probably had detectives in her house. She's probably had somebody where in her mind she's already associated shirt and tie.
Right. And so for most black boys and black men, we already have an association with police officers by the time we have to encounter police officers in the street. So let's cut to it. Let's talk about George Floyd. As an officer, when you see that video, tell me your thoughts.
100% wrong. Murder.
Now, elaborate on that.
So I see that situation when I watched that video, and I've watched it multiple times. Prior to even knowing the backstory of it, it seemed revengeful. It seemed like it was a personal vendetta. It seemed like that person had other motives outside of whatever his contact or whatever his call for service was.
Looking at that from a trained officer, what about that was policy? Was anything about that policy?
That was 100%. And again, not knowing whatever that agency's policy is, but across the board, very uniform-wise, that would have been outside of policies that I'm familiar with.
And would it have been okay for another officer to tap him on the shoulder and say, "Get up"?
100%.
And why do you think that didn't happen? In your opinion?
In my opinion, a lot of officers or even just people in uniform can fall victim of not being able to speak up because they, one, feel that they're not the senior officer on scene, or they may feel that they're not in a position to speak up. Whatever reason that may be.
Right. So, but if you look at that video, and if you look at that officer, don't know his name, don't want to say his name, and even the Asian officer that was on watch, keeping people back, he was in enough control. And the thing that bothered me the most, he was in enough control that he could have turned around and said, "Let off." But he was too busy worried with the crowd. But here's the thing that haunted me. He, at that point, he did not see George Floyd as a human. And he kept telling people, "This is why you don't do drugs. This is why you don't do drugs." As if even if he was on drugs, he didn't deserve that at all.
100.
And so what I see is 4 people, just if a gang, if it's 4 gang members and one person shoots, they all go to prison. I think they all should go to prison. So in terms of when you look at that incident, just the pure, like, that officer was not worried.
Right.
There was not an ounce of concern in his face. And my concern is, or my question to you as an officer, at what point does that type of conduct is not okay even with fellow officers.
So basically, across the board, again, like I said, I've been in some instances very similar to that, obviously with different outcomes, but of situations very similar, whether it be the call for service or being able to try to control someone on the ground in handcuffs. Rule of thumb is if someone's in handcuffs, basically, if there was a fight or if there was some type of pushback or resisting, right? When someone gets in handcuffs, you basically have that person in custody.
Okay.
Now, there can be some instances that someone in handcuffs can still be considered a threat, right? Due to either their feet or even just person.
But he had 3 people pinning him down.
Most definitely. I'm just saying, just hypothetically, just across the board, someone in handcuffs could still be deemed a threat. Now, their threat is minimized because they have their hands behind their back and they're in handcuffs, but they can still be considered a threat nonetheless, right? Someone can still spit on you, someone can still kick you,
right,
whatever it may be.
He's face down pissing on himself under a tire. He's not a threat.
Again, I'm just saying, I'm not even talking to the situation yet, right? I'm just saying across the board, okay, right? Someone in handcuffs can still be there. So therefore, when you're dealing with somebody in that position, you still need to make sure, right? If I don't know if the person, again, this is just me speaking across the board, but whether somebody was searched yet, whether somebody, whether if anything was discarded, basically coming down to an agreement. However, right, it doesn't take 10 minutes to do that.
Not at all.
Period, right? And even then, if the person is already deemed unsafe because he's already been searched, he's already, anything that you might think of as far as an officer being on duty that you want to check off before you continue to move on to the next step, right? At that time, if the person wants to wiggle around, he's already in handcuffs, get up, assess the person, right? Try to put him in the recovery position if he's willing to do that. But if he wants to continue to resist and move around and so on and so forth, because excited delirium is always something we have to take into account, right? If this person's on drugs, if there's prior contacts, whatever it may be. Again, there could be a million different cases and scenarios that you can.
Right. So how did that situation go that bad?
The situation went bad because there was no one took control of that situation besides the person who placed his knee on his back. He was the only one in control. Everybody else was not in control.
So, and at that point, why not even a supervising officer comes on scene and takes control?
I don't think you even need to allow that. Any officer on scene can take control once they see it go south. Because and again, I've done a little bit of research on it. Prior to in that contact, there was a exchange of conversation. And again, I don't know how true this is or not. This is just an article that I read. But there was a conversation that the officer at his feet asked the officer with his knee on the person's neck, on the neck of Mr. Floyd, to basically say, hey, look, let's go ahead and pick him up or place him in a recovery position because I'm worried about excited delirium. When someone gets in a position or gets into excited delirium, basically their heart rate continues to keep pounding, and then you have other complications that might occur.
And at that point, in my opinion, they lost the humanity and did not see the humanity in that man.
Most definitely.
At all.
I agree.
And the thing that when you look at a grown man, African American man, I don't even know what the race of the other cops were, but when you look at that situation, and even after he was dead. Even after he was dead. And if you watch the video closely, when the paramedics got there, he checked his pulse, tapped him on the leg, checked his pulse. When he checked his pulse and got up, he already knew he was dead. And the officer still kept his knee on his neck. When they did not rush off and they took their time to get him on the gurney, took their time to get him into the ambulance, didn't turn the lights on, they knew he was already dead and it was no bringing him back. So they could say that bull about he died at the hospital. He died right there in front of America.
He was pronounced dead at the hospital.
Right. No, I get that. I get that's where they pronounce and they make it legal.
Right.
But we watched a man murdered on live TV. And, I'm not going to say the uprising and the protest and the vandalism and the looting is okay, but I get it.
I understand it.
I get it. And I'm old enough to have been around to the Rodney King. And here's the thing. The Rodney King riots happened after the verdict. Can you imagine what's going to happen if all 4 of those guys don't do prison time or worse? Because in what I see now, let's shift. I'm not even going to go there. Let's shift for a second. Let's bring Kaepernick into this. does Kaepernick now look like a hero? He was already a hero to me.
Mm-hmm.
But how does he look? Because we've had this conversation before.
Right.
In terms of here we are,
Mm-hmm.
and what upset me about that, and I haven't watched the NFL since
Mm-hmm.
he protested, and you know that, is that people, for their own reasons, shifted the narrative and tried to make it about the flag, make it about the military. But here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Black people already got a love-hate relationship with that flag anyway.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have no choice other than that flag.
Mm.
But that flag has our blood on it.
Mm.
So we can step that to the side. However, had people took the protest serious then
Mm-hmm.
and allowed people to protest, have the conversation, let's have the difficult conversation instead of someone like Donald Trump stepping in, calling them sons of bitches. So in my opinion, George Floyd's blood is on his hands too.
Mm.
And anybody else in the NFL and whatever else that shunned this man for a silent, peaceful protest, which what America is founded on.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But now here we are 4 years later.
It's
surprise.
Still with it. Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I mean, it's challenging. It's a reality that unfortunately we have to face. You know, like I said, he's spoke out about it, very articulate on why he was doing what he was doing.
But white supremacy changed the narrative. There's no other.
I agree.
They changed the narrative.
Yep.
And made it about whatever they made it about.
Mm-hmm.
Now here we are. It's not just black people out there protesting.
Right.
And in fact, the protesters and the rioters, African Americans, probably the minority
mm-hmm.
in those situations.
Right.
But here we are, 4 years later. We tried to address it.
Mm-hmm.
We tried to say we need to have conversation. We tried to say this is an issue that needs to be addressed. This is a part of America's heritage, America's history, when we all know that law enforcement in and of itself derived out of, you know, hate and being an overseer and all that stuff mm-hmm. historically. But my question is, for you, now here we are. Out of that movement came Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. Out of that movement became Blue Lives Matter. And in my opinion, that's the antithesis of Black Lives Matter. So now here we are, we're yet at odds again, mm-hmm. right? At what point do we get to policy change? At what point do we change culture of law enforcement? And here's what I mean. And we've had this discussion too. I was happened to be Upland. Mm-hmm. I was in Upland's police department. And we were going for a meeting. I forget what the meeting was. But on the wall is all the old-timey police pictures. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, they weren't some of them, when you get back into the older ones, they look no different than guys who belong to the Klan standing up in there. Mm. And what I mean by that is even when you go back into the heritage of law enforcement, like, at what point do we get policy change? At what point do we change the culture of law enforcement?
And I think that, and I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I was saying that, and I can only speak from the position of, because again, I know that, again, like I said, that people that feel the way that they feel, they have some realities that encourage them to feel that way. Okay. That's their reality. I remember being in the academy, and there's a block basically that talks about these topics. They talk about how the Black community looks at law enforcement. Mm-hmm. They basically had a conversation with all the potential trainees going into a career in law enforcement, and asking them basically what their background was, where did they grow up, and then ask very difficult questions and see how people thought based off of their upbringing, where they grew up, and, you know, basically whatever the people they hang around with and all that. Basically anything that would influence their thought process.
Okay.
The conversations were very tough. You had people who said things that were borderline racist. You had people that said things that were borderline, that were borderline bias, right? We basically talked about biasness. We talked about just basically why people thought the way that they thought. At the end of that class, it was very refreshing. It was like an elephant was taken out of the room because you got to basically really have that conversation
and
in
I don't
uniform.
think in this day and age, most people don't want to have those conversations.
Exactly. Now, I tell people that unfortunately, we see that law enforcement has a lot of flaws. A lot of policies have a lot of flaws. A lot of people have been impacted and have been wrongly accused, wrongly arrested, wrongly treated based off of these flawed policies.
Right. But not only the flawed policies, they were applied biased. They were applied unfairly.
Exactly. But now I have seen within law enforcement that law enforcement has adjusted and has basically accepted some of these flaws. We're not going to see the result of those changes probably anytime soon.
Okay.
There are more, I've taken to go to my Facebook to post a lot of black officers in uniforms that I know personally that grew up in the inner city of San Bernardino, who have basically the same upbringing as me, the same walk of life as me, basically the same history with law enforcement, and they made a decision to become the change that they wanted to see. Right. Took it upon themselves to police the same neighborhood that they hold dear to their heart.
Right. So I had a conversation with a friend, and here's when we talk about policy change, as you know, becoming an officer is fine, but what about the leadership? When we're talking about police chief, we're talking captains, we're talking politicians that affect how policies are written in law enforcement. So my thing is, we need more people. And how do we get more people? Not only to get into law enforcement, but to move up through the ranks. So policies can be changed. Not only voting in and out politicians, but at the same time becoming a part of the department, but not to the degree that now all of a sudden is you're just becoming one of, the bad seeds, if you will.
Like I said, I think really, there is, just in our counties alone, there's a lot of black chiefs. The city of West Covina has one, the city of Ontario, the city of Upland. There's also a lot in the county. There's a lot of minorities that sit on the executive board who have power to be able to have these conversations. So I think, like I said, it goes back to the fact that things are already in motion.
Okay.
These conversations are being had at the powers that be to be able to make sure that these things are not occurring negatively towards a certain demographic of people.
Right. So for us on the outside looking in, why is it, and you may not know, but I want you to answer it anyway, why is it that for us on the outside looking in, that people with a racist undertone, a racist background, a racist view, but not only that, have proven themselves to be overly aggressive or continue to break policy? Why is it that something this drastic has to happen before these people are removed from the force? Because this officer had several complaints, been involved in several incidents, but why is it for us that prejudice, racism continues to be able to exist and not be checked in law enforcement?
It's a good question. Again, I think like with a lot of these instances, we see this a lot occur in places outside of California.
Okay.
And I can speak.
Okay.
I mean,
because
if I'm wrong,
we don't have to leave the city to see this. But go ahead.
I'm saying as far as recent events.
Okay.
Right. Things that have been known and documented. Of course, there might be some other instances that are unknown to me, but majority of the ones that we've identified have occurred outside of the state of California,
or televised,
right? Things that are nationally known, right? Policing is different throughout different states. Different states have different times, different.
But at the same
practices.
Time, I understand that, but it goes unchecked. And here's the thing: most of us, a lot of us, probably tried to become COs, security guards, law enforcement, military. And they do these background checks and they do the psychological exams. Why is it that so many people with racist undertones can get through? But more importantly, when things happen, it's not corrected. It's not checked. It's not, nobody stands up and say, not okay. And we can segue, and this goes along with it, with our trip to the gun range. With our trip to the gun range. And the reason why, to me, why that's important, talking about racial undertones, going into that gun range where I assume a lot of law enforcement frequent was like walking into the KKK den. Walking right into their front living room. So my thing is, if me as an officer and who I am as a person, there's no way I could associate with that, knowing that you might as well have had a hood hanging up in the corner. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this goes unchecked for centuries. It goes unchecked, and the reason being is because, in my opinion, they're one and the same. They're one and the same. So just like we say white folks are visitors into hip hop, minorities are visitors into law enforcement. It's theirs. And that's how they see it. So when people stand up, or when people try to come forward, yeah, they're going to give us, we can become chiefs, we can become captains, we become all that stuff. Okay. But when you look at the system of it, the larger, broader system of it, there is no way that an organization, whether it's a national organization, local, that is going to continue to allow, whether it's police brutality, whether it's racism, anything that's going to tarnish what I heard a captain say today, or chief, you're not going to tarnish the badge. So for us, the badge has been tarnished, but we keep seeing these things going unchecked. And for us, it's unfortunate. We want to love law enforcement. We want to be a part of law enforcement. But yet again, it's like walking into the lion's den.
Okay.
So when me and you and Joshua went to the gun range, and I shared this story with you, and you could tell me what your response was when I got there, automatically I felt uneasy. Like when I stood in the doorway because of COVID, they were letting us in slowly, but I felt uneasy. And then I saw it, and I'm looking around. I put my back to the wall so I could, I'm an OG, so I know how to get safe. So I put my back to the wall, and my head is on the swivel. I know nothing's going to break out. Everybody got guns, so nobody's going to get stupid when everybody got guns. Now, it wasn't. So I saw a dude in camouflage. He had camouflage from head to toe. I just thought he was a weirdo. Why are you at a gun range in full fatigues, right? Okay. But then I remember seeing a kind of tall, clean cut white guy in a cap, and he gave me the worst feeling. He gave me the most, like, I was most uneasy with him. And so I remember putting my back to the wall, and I kept my eye on him. The normal public would have saw a clean cut, preppy looking white guy. I saw a threat. And when we finally got in, he never looked us in the eye, right? He was kind of standoffish. He went around and he went and purchased a gun. And lo and behold, so when I told you that story, what did you say?
I'm trying to remember what I said, but I think I did remember seeing the individual that was sitting there, the guy that you described, and
so to refresh your memory.
Help me out here.
Right. To refresh your memory, when I told you that story when we was playing dominoes, you said, "Oh, the police officer, he was a cop."
Yep.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
So how does a gazelle know that there's a threat coming? It's in its DNA. So when something is lurking and if something is ready to attack, it's built in its DNA to know danger. When I was at that gun range, even before I got in and saw all the propaganda, I saw, and he was in plain clothes, something about my spirit said he's the threat. He came in, he went around us, and he didn't say anything out of the ordinary, but his aura, his energy said, if I was on the street, I don't have to be scared of the dude in camouflage. I don't even have to be scared of the other people that were there. He's my threat.
Okay.
But picture that. He's clean cut, tall, had on, some jeans and a hat. But my spirit said, if anything jumps off, watch him. The rest of the normal public or people that don't have my experience is not going to experience him that way. And so the rest of the time I was in there, and I told you this, I couldn't even enjoy myself just based off of all the propaganda that was in there. And so, sure, we stayed, we gave him our money, but on a different day, I would have walked out. But here's what I want you to understand, and here's the point that I'm making. To me, in a situation, the biggest threat in that entire situation was that guy. Where most white people would have saw him and would have thought nothing of it. They probably would have been like, ooh, is he single? Can he date my daughter? Now, here's the other problem. If me and him gets into a conflict and law enforcement rolls up, who's the threat? And there is no mistake in that. If me and him get into an argument, whether they know he's law enforcement or not, when they roll up, automatically they're gonna assume I'm the problem, I'm the threat, and he's going to be the one telling the truth, and so forth and so on. And there's no denying that fact. So in that situation, somebody who you identified just because because you're in law enforcement, somebody that you identified as from just standing there, oh, he's a cop, and not to mention he went around to purchase a new weapon, that I perceived him as a threat. And so the reason why that's important, even in this day, for us, for people that are raised in the inner city, and even when we have relatives that's law enforcement, you're not going to be on the scene if something goes down, right? Most likely, it's not going to be somebody that's going to give me the benefit of the doubt. They're going to assume I'm a threat. They're going to assume that I'm dangerous, and then they're going to treat me accordingly. When we look at George Floyd, when you look at that entire situation, they already had him under control. There's a new video that came out, showed that they were beating him in the back of the police car, and somehow he ended up back outside the car. Now, what I'm saying is, for us, recently there was a movie, When They See Us. That's a real thing. Now, it was a great movie, but as a therapist, as a psychotherapist, one of the things we know as a proven fact is that side by side, society, when it comes to African American boys and men, they see us differently. It is very hard for the psyche of America to see us as victims. It is very hard for the psyche of America to see us as non-threatening. We have to prove ourselves as non-threatening to be considered not a threat. You follow what I'm saying? Yep. So, but the problem is that's woven into law enforcement. It's woven into law enforcement.
So how does it change?
You tell me. And here's the reason why, and you say, how does it change? It's going to start with the leadership. But hopefully, if anything comes out of this uprising, is that now we can have the authentic conversation. I hate when people say, I don't see color. So some white cop or whoever may think they're saying something right when they say, I don't see color. To me, when you say I don't see color, you're telling me you don't see me. So it's not about not seeing color. It's more about honoring who I am. So I see my color.
But do you think across the board that the Black community sees their color a lot more important than every other race?
We have to.
Agreed. So then someone who doesn't understand that, who's not Black, they may think that it's okay for them to say that I don't see color because they're thinking that they're looking across the board with no boundaries.
But that tells me that those people who say I don't see color, that tells me they have not taken the time out to try to learn other cultures. They haven't taken the time out to try to get to know other people. And so what I mean by that is, and when you say, do we as people see our color more than anybody else, how do we not in this society?
Right.
We have to.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing: if I decide, you know what, I'm not black, I'm OJ. If I decide that, then basically I'm feeding myself to the wolves, because I know, and it's funny because when you hear my name, Jonathan Beauregard, right? When I go on job interviews, they're expecting a white person, and I see the energy shift when I walk in the room, because they weren't expecting a big black dude. Now, for us as African Americans, every day is about race. And people don't want to believe that. People always want to say, why you always got to bring up race? Why you always got to pull the race card? The race card is always there. And so, and to deny that tells me you don't see me and see my experience. But when you decide that you're ready to be a little bit uncomfortable, but more importantly, to address your own biases, see, I think every police officer needs to go through some type of class to address their implicit biases or their unconscious biases, so that in that way, maybe they're not aware.
Yeah, and that's the class, like, again, that I was referring to, that's being taught, an 8-hour block that's being taught within the academies.
Law enforcement,
current date.
Right? Law enforcement needs to be a part of it. Teachers need to be a part of it. Social workers need to be anybody that's in the people services.
Yeah, we
need to have those classes.
I believe in that class that there is somebody from the county. There is a psychologist. That it's basically built. It's a whole week of basically that's what's geared towards, as far as from a law enforcement perspective, from a service perspective, as well as the psyche and all that stuff, and allowing that conversation to be kind of spoken about, so that way people can be aware of it. Because if somebody who is from a city where they haven't really encountered a black person, and they don't know about black culture, they don't know about the black community, they haven't never even had a conversation with somebody who is black.
Right.
How could we ask that person to understand if they haven't been introduced to it?
But when does that person, follow me on this, when did that person come out of their comfort zone and try to immerse themselves, or at least invite themselves to learn something new?
Right.
Here's the problem. White is right. The oppressor never asked the oppressed for permission. So, and here's what I mean by that, is that if I'm a white guy from the other side of the track, why I'm right. What the academy teaches me is right. What I was raised as is I'm right. So why would I ever get to know you? Here's one of the things that we know is proof, is that the oppressed knows way more about the oppressor than the oppressor knows about the oppressed. Because we have to for survival. So here's my point. So after they take those classes, if they didn't take the classes, they get their little continuing education units, and then that's all they do with it, it's no good.
Right.
Now you take those classes, you confront yourself, don't beat yourself up, own your biases. They're not your fault, most likely. You were raised that way. Your environment perpetuated that. So you're good. Nobody's going to blame you for your biases. We all have biases. So let's get that out the way.
Right.
But now, if I want to do something about it, and if I want to do something different, now I have to go include myself. When we talk about cultural inclusion, okay, go to an African American event, go to a multicultural event, but don't just go. Try the food, drink the Kool-Aid, like whatever.
Yeah.
Be a part of it.
Right.
But then really challenge others. See, here's the thing. If I'm comfortable with you and then me and you do something stupid, and I know I'm going to go unchecked, but if I try to do something stupid and you say, hold on, that's not right. That's how we start to get to change. But the thing is, for people who are in law enforcement, I don't know what psychological testing they do, but if it doesn't address race and culture, then it falls short. It falls short. Because from what I can tell, when I've tried to become a CEO and all this other stuff, they just want to know if you're a liar and you're going to steal some money. It's very rarely about race. Now here's the thing, and they did this study, and we're going to end soon. So they did there's a lot of studies out there. When it comes to kids, white America or society sees African American kids at a minimum 5 years older than what they really are, but 5 years older than their counterpart. The reason why that's important is because even in school, the attitude and the treatment is harsher because they see us as older and more culpable and more responsible for our behaviors.
Mm.
So a white kid can do the same thing and get sympathy. A black kid will do the very similar behavior and will get a harsher punishment, suspension, whatever it may be. Now, fast forward to when you're in society, right? So a 14-year-old kid is going to get manhandled because a white cop sees a 19-year-old threat versus a 14-year-old kid who probably needs a little bit of scare straight, call his mama, and come get him. But that 14-year-old kid, and that's why when we bring up Trayvon Martin, that's why white America did not bleed for that boy.
Mm.
They did not have any sympathy for that boy because they saw somebody a lot older and a lot more responsible when a grown man killed that kid.
Mm-hmm.
That's why. Until that type of psyche changes, we're going to continue to be here. But officers, law enforcement, they don't, it still falls short
Mm-hmm.
because they don't want to address race. Because you would think a peace officer wouldn't be racist. Are you kidding me? Like, seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So my point is, it's not going to change until we talk about the elephant in the living room.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to do further background checks. And if there's any inkling of racial undertones or being a part of something and so forth, then they need to figure out, is there a recourse for that? But the psyche of America, and I don't think people understand that, the psyche of America when it comes to African Americans, particularly African American boys and men, they see us differently. When that movie came out,
Mm-hmm.
I could not watch the whole thing because it resonated so real.
Mm.
Because they see us differently. They don't see, I say it like this. I've been a professional for a long time and worked around a lot of white people. Good people, I don't have no qualms or nothing like that. But I used to always hear this term, oh, he's safe. Oh, he's safe. Oh, he's the safe man. Oh, he's safe. He's safe. He's safe. And I got to wondering, what do they mean by that safe?
Mm.
What they were saying was, at some point, because of my professionalism and, the willing to go through the ranks and all that stuff, I wasn't a threat. So for black people, if you don't prove yourself as not being safe, and if you don't prove yourself as not being a threat, then you're not going to progress in their eyes. And what I mean by that is when we talk about the psyche of something, we're not talking about somebody's opinion. We're not talking about something somebody read or something somebody was convinced of. When we're talking about the psyche of somebody, we're talking about who they are,
Mm-hmm.
deep down to their core. And when we talk about, and we can even add in the Central Park, that lady went to her psyche. When she acted and went on to say, I'm going to call the police because you're threatening me as a black woman, that didn't come out of, oh, this is a great idea. That came out of her psyche that's embedded in her as a white person.
Mm.
That's what we're dealing with. And I don't think people understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think law enforcement understand it. So when you have a law enforcement officer on scene and that psyche kicks in, how do you combat that? Especially if you're not aware.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand.
So we got a long road, and I thank you for coming on. I probably didn't get to all the questions, but we're right at an hour. So I appreciate you. I love you.
Love you too. Appreciate you for having me.
You got to take care of my niece. So for those of you out there watching, we appreciate you joining in. This has been Indestructible Soul. You can catch it on the podcast. You can restream it or watch it again. We're going to be broadcasting every Sunday with different topics, different guests. I want to thank my nephew JR for coming on and really taking the risk to put himself out there. And if any of your comrades or your law enforcement buddies got a problem with it, tell them come see me. All right. You want to say any last words?
Appreciate you for having me. One thing that I've gotten to realize during these times is that I really, seeing the riots and seeing the looting and seeing the protesting, um, from from people from my community, black people, people from all different walks. Um, it doesn't stop here, because that building at the end of the day, that's just a building. So what are we going to continue to do? I encourage you to go to your city town hall meetings, uh, go over there and speak up. I encourage you to continue to keep having these same conversations that we just had with people from different perspectives. Because if you're talking to the same people who think like you, who have the same perspective as you, you're not gonna get nowhere. I encourage you to have the bravery to talk to somebody who thinks completely different as you. Have that conversation again, even if you don't agree. Um, at least be able to be mature enough to have that conversation, so then that way you can maybe see something from a different perspective, because it's going to take all of us. And like I said, we have a long road ahead of us, but definitely, as a father, it's my right and it's my due diligence to keep trying, even as hard as impossible as it may seem, because I have a daughter, a young black daughter who's going to grow up in this society, and I owe it to her. Again, that's what I forgot to, kind of highlight. The reason why I became an officer is because in the delivery room, I held my daughter and I asked myself, what am I doing to make sure that when she grows up, she's going to have a little bit easier time than I did? So I encourage you guys to, like I said, take on that responsibility to make sure that your loved ones and your family and your kids and their kids have it a little bit easier.
Appreciate you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Like I said, you could catch us on Sundays. I'll be broadcasting. And to all the families out there that's been affected by not only the COVID-19 and the riots, God bless you. Stay prayed up. And we're in this together. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.